Why some people cannot sustain their manifestation. I think a lot of people secretly believe that once they finally achieve something, meaningful, something inside of them will finally settle. But what happens when the achievement arrives and then the internal peace doesn't? See, I used to think achievement would finally stabilize me emotionally, not because I consciously said that to myself, but because underneath ambition was a quieter belief. Once I arrived somewhere meaningful enough, maybe I would finally feel whole there. And honestly, I think a lot of people are carrying that belief without realizing it. They think once I get the degree, the relationship, the money, the opportunity, the recognition, the breakthrough, something inside of me will finally settle. But one of the most confusing experiences of my life was realizing achievement did not automatically create emotional stability. In some ways, it exposed the instability more clearly. See, I had a breakdown in my dorm room while attending UCLA and considered ending everything. Everything. And I'm careful with the language that I use here because I don't want to soften my experience and what happened by calling it a difficult season or a dark time. I just want to be honest with it. It was a breakdown. It was a breakdown. Something in me fractured underneath the weight of pressure, expectation, exhaustion, striving, and an identity I was trying to force myself to live inside. And what made it even more psychologically confusing was this. I had already achieved something I once believed would prove I was enough. That contradiction stayed with me for years because from the outside, my life looked like movement, progress, expansion. I walked UCLA's graduation stage early before technically finishing. I studied abroad in Paris, France. I kept pushing. I kept achieving. But internally, something still felt fragmented. And honestly, that experience forced me to confront something I think many people quietly experience after a major achievement. Sometimes success changes your circumstances faster than it changes your identity. That is a much deeper problem than people realize. Because most conversations about manifestation or transformation focus mostly entirely on obtaining, how to get the thing, how to attract the thing, how to achieve the thing. Very few conversations ask, can your identity emotionally hold what arrives?
Does he have any forks?
He don't have, no.
Okay, no spoons or anything.
That question changed my life. Because looking back now, I realized I was trying to use achievements to create emotional resolution. But achievement and embodiment are not the same thing. You can accomplish something externally while internally remaining organized around instability, inadequacy, emotional exhaustion, or old survival patterns. And when that happens, success can actually expose hidden fractures instead of repairing them. See, that was my experience.
What you say?
I remember being in Paris while privately carrying the deterioration of my relationship with my boyfriend. I was surrounded by beauty, movement, expansion, opportunity, and still emotionally unraveling internally. That taught me something I would understand much more deeply years later. A change in scenario does not automatically solve a pattern. You can move environments while carrying the same identity structure into every room you enter. And this is where I think many people misunderstand transformation completely. People often assume if they feel emotionally unstable after achievement, then the achievement must not have been meaningful enough. So they chase another milestone, another goal, another accomplishment. But sometimes the issue is not the achievement itself. Sometimes the issue is that the self underneath the achievement was never reorganized to sustain the new reality. Okay, psychology research around identity-based behavior supports this more than people realize. Researchers studying identity and self-regulation have found that behavior is deeply connected to self-concept and identity relevance, not just motivation alone. In other words, people tend to behave in ways that reinforce who they believe themselves to be psychologically. And that matters because you can consciously desire a new life while subconsciously remaining emotionally organized around an older version of yourself. And under pressure, people often return toward what feels psychologically familiar, even when what feels familiar is painful. That does not always mean someone lacks discipline. Sometimes it means the nervous system still recognizes the old identity as home. And honestly, I think this is why some people cannot sustain what they manifest, not because manifestation failed, but because achievement arrived before identity coherence did. And if identity remains fragmented underneath the success, eventually the hidden tensions begins surfacing somewhere, emotionally, relationally, behaviorally, and psychologically. That tension surfaced in me long before I fully understood it. See, at the time, I thought I was simply exhausted. Years later, I realized something was deeper that was happening. I was succeeding inside an identity I was never fully rooted in. And that realization was deeply uncomfortable for me because I had spent years believing ambition itself was proof of alignment. I thought if I wanted something badly enough, if I worked hard enough, if I achieved enough, then naturally the life I was building must belong to me. But desire alone does not always reveal congruence. Sometimes desire reveals survival. And I think that distinction is important because years later, when I looked back at my relationship with achievement, I realized much of what drove me through school was not only ambition. It was recognition. It was that I wanted to be seen, valued, affirmed. I wanted proximity to environments that made me feel significant, intelligent, capable, important. And honestly, I don't think that I'm alone in that. A lot of people are not just pursuing success, they are pursuing emotional confirmation through success. That changes the psychological structure underneath achievement entirely. Because now the achievement is carrying emotional weight it was never designed to hold. And eventually, that pressure surfaces somewhere. For me, it surfaced through collapse. I had spent years forcing myself through environments I was capable of succeeding in, but not always emotionally rooted in. And this is where I began understanding something that later became central to my work. Borrowed identities can carry a person surprisingly far before the fracture finally appears. That realization hit me hard because even though I succeeded academically, there was another truth underneath it that I had ignored for years. I never truly loved school itself. School often functioned more like escape for me. Structure, distance from instability, proof, validation. But my deepest sense of aliveness had always existed in the arts. And now looking back, I can see the tension clearly. I was succeeding in one identity while secretly belonging to another. That creates psychological conflict whether people recognize it consciously or not. And I think this happens to many people. People inherit identities before they examine them, from family, from culture, teachers, religion, environment, social expectations. Go to school, get the degree, build the life, perform stability. And sometimes people become extremely successful inside identities they never consciously chose. That does not mean those paths are wrong, but it does mean achievement alone cannot answer the deeper question. Does this life actually belong to me emotionally? That is a very different question than can I achieve it? And honestly, I think many people spend years focusing or confusing rather capability with congruence. Just because you can perform an identity does not mean your nervous system feels at home inside of it. That distinction matters more than people realize because eventually the body, the emotions, or the psyche often begins resisting what the conscious mind keeps trying to force. And I think that that is partly why emotional familiarity matters so much in transformation. Researchers studying identity-based behavior have repeatedly found that people tend to act in ways that maintain consistency with their existing self-concept. So in simple terms, the psyche prefers psychological familiarity even when familiarity is limiting. That means a person can consciously want expansion while subconsciously feeling safer inside an older emotional identity. Safer inside proving, safer inside instability, safer inside striving, safer inside emotional survival. And if that underlying identity remains intact, achievement alone rarely reveals the deeper tension. Sometimes it intensifies it because now there is an external life growing around an internal self that still feels fragmented. And honestly, that fragmentation is exhausting. It creates a strange emotional contradiction where someone can appear successful externally while privately feeling disconnected from themselves internally. I know that feeling intimately because even after graduating, even after surviving everything it took to get there, something in me still knew achievement had not answered the deeper identity question underneath my life. And I think this is where many people misinterpret what manifestation actually is. They think manifestation is mainly about obtaining, getting the opportunity, getting the relationship, getting the success, getting the visibility, getting the life. But I no longer think obtaining is the deepest challenge. I think sustaining is. Because obtaining can happen through intensity, but sustaining usually requires coherence. And those are not the same thing. Intensity can push a person towards achievement temporarily. Coherence allows a person to emotionally inhabit what they achieved without collapsing underneath it. That is a massive difference. And honestly, I wish more people talked about this because a lot of people are quietly believing if I'm still struggling after achieving something meaningful, then something must be wrong with me. But I think sometimes achievement simply exposes identity structures that striving temporarily concealed. When you are chasing constantly, you do not always have time to examine the emotional architecture underneath the pursuit. But once something arrives, once the milestone is reached, once the striving slows down, the unresolved self often becomes visible again. That does not mean the achievement was meaningless, and it does not mean your ambition was fake. It means transformation may need to happen deeper than circumstance. That realization changed the way I understood manifestation entirely, because now when I think about transformation, I no longer ask only, how do I get the life I want? I ask, can my identity emotionally hold the life I say I want? That is a much more honest question. And honestly, I think many people are exhausting themselves trying to force outcomes while never examining the self underneath the force. They're trying harder, pushing harder, achieving more, while the old identity remains emotionally untouched beneath all of it. And eventually the psyche pulls people back toward what still feels psychologically familiar. Not always because they are weak, not always because they lack discipline, but because familiarity has gravity. That is why I believe transformation becomes real when returning to the old self or the old version of yourself no longer feels emotionally natural. That is what becoming unreturnable means to me. Not perfection, not becoming fearless, not transcending struggle, becoming emotionally rooted enough in a new identity that the self no longer feels like home. And honestly, I think that may be one of the deepest forms of freedom a person can experience. Because eventually the goal stops being performing transformation, and it starts becoming, embodying it. That is the difference. And that difference changed my life.